Welcome to the Hoover Institution's Washington, D.C. office. My name is Mike Frank, and I'm the director here. And it's my real pleasure today to be able to introduce our honored guest. Heather Hendershot is a professor at MIT. She is a professor of film and media there, has written a number of books. We met about a year ago at a conference that was put on by the Buckley program at Yale. And I can see that she, at the time, that she has a real affinity for trying to understand the connections between the communications world and the media world on the one hand, and different elements of the conservative movement on the other. So it's this is a natural kind of outgrowth of her previous work, looking at that general area. Open to Debate is the book. Heather has watched not maybe every single one of 33 years worth of Firing Line episodes, but pretty close to it, I think. So she's probably the reigning expert now on all things related to Firing Line. So please help me welcome Heather Hendershot to the podium.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here, particularly just here at the Hoover Institution, because the Hoover was so important to the research I did on the book. I was out at Stanford where all the papers are, and of course they've preserved all the episodes and so on, but the papers and transcripts, I really couldn't have done it without the Hoover Institution, so it's great to be here. The first thing that people ask me about this book is, you know, why did you write it? And the short, quick answer, in part it's this guy. I had been working on the book since 2011, and but about a year and a half ago, it became sort of more urgent as our level of discourse seemed to be deteriorating and the kind of shouting matches seemed to be increasing and so on. It seemed like a particularly important time to be talking about a show that really valued civil discourse, civil debate between people who disagreed with each other. And so part of the reason and the sort of genesis of the book is from that impulse. But the other source of the book is more personal, about my intellectual development. The book that I published in 2011, What's Fair on the Air, Cold War Right-Wing Broadcasting and the Public Interest, was about the extremist who emerged in radio and television, mostly radio, local radio, but also somewhat on TV, in the years following Barry Goldwater's defeat in 1964. So Barry Goldwater totally flamed out in the election. He got 10 million votes, but he was really trounced. And people had a sense that, oh, liberalism has won forever, the conservative movement is dead, et cetera, et cetera. But a conservative movement blossomed in the wake of that defeat, and some of it was on the sort of more legitimate side, what William F. Buckley was advocating for. But there were also quite a bit of, there was a lot of extremism, paranoia, conspiratorial thinking, people like the John Birch Society emerging at the time, people who thought that the fluoridation of water was a communist conspiracy, that President Eisenhower was a conscious, dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy, was something that the John Birch Society said. And so these folks took to the airwaves, and with their conspiratorial, paranoid thinking, and anti-civil rights and so on. And Buckley, at first, was appearing on some of their TV shows. This is him in the early 50s on a show called Facts Forum that was created by H.L. Hunt, who was a Texas oil billionaire who put a lot of his fortune into anti-communist television and radio. And so Buckley was a regular guest on that show, but he figured out pretty quickly that this guy was bad for the movement. He was bad for the image of conservatism. He was an extremist and paranoid and so on. Just to tell you a little bit about Buckley, he emerged as a national figure in 1951 with the publication of God and Man at Yale, an attack on his alma mater for its liberalism, secular humanism, and so on. And this made him a kind of minor celebrity. The book edged in to the bestseller list at about number 14 or so. So he became known from this book. But he really became known for a few years later, 1965, when he ran for mayor of New York. Because if you run for mayor of New York, you become a kind of national figure, not just a local figure to New York City. And he ran as a protest candidate. He ran on the conservative ticket. He was protesting that John Lindsay, it's kind of small, but you see him right in the middle there, was running on the Republican ticket but was not conservative in any way. And Buckley very famously was asked, what would you do, what's the first thing you'll do if you're elected? And he said, demand a recount because it just seemed so unlikely, you know. And sure enough, he did not win, but he had staked a claim for, you know, conservative republicanism. And this put him in a really good position to start his own TV show just 1 year later. Because he was so articulate in the media. And there was a kind of great coup for his campaign in the middle of it all where there was a newspaper strike. So that meant that the radio and TV coverage of the campaign increased dramatically. And Buckley was great on TV. And he was great in part, not only because he was so articulate and so smart and so charming and used really long words that a lot of people didn't understand, but they sounded great. But he was not afraid to show what he really thought and felt. So here he is with John Lindsay. Lindsay looks peeved, and Buckley is just so bored. Because Lindsay is just not very articulate and smart and interesting, and Buckley complained that Lindsay wrote his own speeches with ear-clanging syntax. Just terrible syntax. And so people wrote letters to Buckley, and often the letters would say, you know, I really disagree with you, I would never vote for you, but thanks a lot for just being honest and, you know, pointing to how much of politics was kind of rigmarole. Like, for example, he would decline to go to parades. Because he's like, we're not going to talk about policy at parades, that's just image stuff. And he didn't want to do that. And he was really campaigning part-time for mayor. He was writing his magazine, he was writing his editorial columns, and so on. So he was seen as the sort of honest candidate, even by people who thought that he was much too right-wing and much too conservative for them. So the year after the campaign, he started his television show Firing Line, which ran from 1966 to 1999, about 1,500 episodes. And I want to show you a clip from that very first year with David Susskind as the guest. Susskind was a TV talk show host. He was well known as a liberal. He had a show called Open End, and it was called Open End because it was open-ended. If the conversation was going well, they would just keep talking for a few hours. It was at the end of the broadcast day. If the conversation wasn't go well, let's cut it off at 30, 45 minutes. It's kind of amazing that this was happening at the time. So he was one of the earliest guests that Buckley had on the show, and I will show you actually 2 clips from the show to give you a sense of the flavor of the program.
Having rediscovered for, I think, perhaps the first time in television history, that people are interesting. It was he who founded the program Open End, dedicated precisely to that proposition, which permitted viewers to listen for as many as 3 hours at a stretch to playwrights, artists, thieves, prostitutes, ideologues, permitting them a full communication of the flavor of their views and of their ideas. For this we are very grateful to him. Susskind is a staunch liberal. If there were a contest for the title Mr. Eleanor Roosevelt, he would unquestionably win it. The question we are to discuss today is whether there is in this country such thing as a prevailing bias, and if so, where does it point? Mr. Susskind, you are most welcome. Would you, in a few thousand words, give us your preliminary views on this?
I wonder if I were unwelcome, how you'd introduce me. I must say that I regard that introduction as somewhat rude and insulting, Mr. Buckley. I hoped on the occasion if you were having your own television program, you would abandon your traditional penchant for personal bitchiness and stick to facts and issues, but evidently your rude behavior is congenital and compulsive, and so I forgive you.
I've always known about the generosity of your broad spirit.
So what a genteel disagreement, right? Susskind is just fuming. You know, he's got such a short fuse, and Buckley has not always a long fuse, but in this case he does. So it's a really charming meeting of people who clearly can't really stand each other. And I'll just show you one more clip from that same episode.
And under the circumstances, I hope you're not here to deny that, by and large, the news services and the television industry and the schools and the universities are liberal dominated, are you? Or are you?
Well, if you use it in any pejorative sense, of course I do. I think that the entire thrust of our country in the last 40 years has been a liberal thrust in our legislation, in our churches, in our schools, in our communications media. There's nothing sinister or evil. We call that progress.
Okay, so Susskind is really expressing the dominant line at the time. And I mean, I think it points to how lunatic it would have seemed to have had a conservative public affairs talk show in 1966. People are like, what? It's a liberal country. What are you talking about? And so it's just kind of amazing. In addition to political guests, Buckley also had cultural figures, artistic figures, Bach specialists. He was devoted to Bach, and he would have Rosalind Turek on playing and discussing Bach and so on. And I wanted to show you a clip from the episode with Norman Mailer, just to give you a sense of what he did outside of the strictly political kind of discussion. Of course, this conversation is not apolitical. It is from 1968, and Mailer has just published Armies of the Night. And shortly after he appeared on the show, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it was about the March on the Pentagon. And the opening here is Buckley reading aloud from, I believe, Time magazine, their coverage of Mailer at this event.
As the after all said was after more obscenities, Mailer introduced poet Robert Lowell, who got annoyed at requests to speak louder. I'll bellow, but it won't do any good, he said, and proceeded to read from Lord Weary's Castle. By the time the action took to the Pentagon, Mailer was perky enough to get himself arrested by 2 marshals. Quotes, I transgressed a police line, he explained with some pride, on the way to the lockup, where the toilet facilities are scarce indeed, and the coffee mugs are low octane.
It's not your time, where the toilet facilities are scarce.
That's pretty good, isn't it?
It's good for time.
That's what you were talking about. You were talking about micturation in your book. I never thought I'd utter a word with that many syllables.
That's it's the influence. It's because of our close and continuing correspondent. That's another example of Time magazine at work, though. You know, they earlier in this they talk about engaging in a scatological solo. You know, extraordinary, ambiguous remark. And what was I doing? Was I acting like a monkey, throwing gobbets? You know, that's what you get from the idea of a scatological solo. Whereas actually, the confession I made that night was about micturation, wasn't it? So you know, there's a physical, spiritual, and probably a philosophical difference between scatological matters and acts of micturation.
Well, I can see that you're a student of the subject.
I'm glad you can keep up with it.
I didn't say I could. I thought I could do this yourself. Let's try to refocus the discussion. Mine is the Time magazine observed.
Okay, so maybe the first and last time the word micturation was used on American television, or really on any television show. I'm sure all of you are very sophisticated and know what micturation means, but it means urination. So it's a very sophisticated discussion about the scatological versus the micturation and so on. Really charming kind of debate between people with very different worldviews, but people who really enjoyed this kind of sparring match of talking about their ideas on the show. Buckley also had the spokespeople of the various radical social movements going on throughout the 60s and 70s. Quite notably, he had Black Power folks on the show. This is Milton Henry, and I'm not sure everyone can see, but we've got him wearing this giant ankh, and he has 2 security guards behind him in fatigues who never move throughout the whole thing, you know, and they're unarmed, but probably they usually are armed. There's some kind of negotiation with the producer to not have guns on the show, and Buckley never acknowledges that they're there. It's kind of amazing. He never even makes eye contact. He just talks to Milton Henry. And what's radical, in part, about this, the appearance of Black Power on the show is that the coverage of Black Power elsewhere was mostly sensationalist, sound bites, this kind of thing. And Nixon had actually conveyed to the networks in the early 70s that they really shouldn't cover Black Power anymore. They should really, really just ignore it. And he also said, you know, he encouraged them not to cover Vietnam as well, and they did not take that advice. They continued to cover Vietnam. But they did minimize their coverage of Black Power. And so if you wanted to learn about Black Power and you didn't subscribe to one of their newsletters or this kind of thing, Firing Line was a good place to learn about it, for better or for worse. Whether you thought it was a great idea or a terrible idea, you could hear the ideas expressed unedited on the show. And so that was really remarkable. He also had, oh, and here's Eldridge Cleaver on the show. He also covered the women's liberation movement on the program. He had Betty Friedan on early on, and she was not a very good speaker. She was kind of inarticulate, and she wasn't invited back for 18 years. And she was the voice of a kind of mainstream liberal feminism. A much better episode was with Germaine Greer, who had just published The Female Eunuch and was much more radical than Friedan. And Buckley really enjoyed talking to her. So I'm going to show you a little clip from that encounter from the early 70s.
The paradox, which appears sometimes like a contradiction in my book. Are you to make he and she words equal in estimation, or are you to screen out she as forever incapable of equaling he in estimation, grammatically?
But grammatically?
You could be anti-feminist, you see, by suppressing feminism, by suppressing the femaleness of a pronoun.
But there's no implied hierarchy as far as I can see.
Oh, there is.
When a Scots woman says you should never refer to early man, you should refer to early humans, which means that you can't use the synecdoche.
But not only that, what it means is that the real attitude is going to be concealed by a form of primitive censorship, by a kind of ritual observance, whereas the actual situation won't change. It's like calling people Ms. when in fact they're married. It doesn't change the character of their marriage. And I think it's a sort of hypocrisy.
No, in other words, you think that the emphasis on nomenclature is preposterous.
Well, I think it's such a trivial aspect of a real struggle, and it's been given so much attention. I think it's part of a general movement to co-opt a struggle for existence, really, and turn it into something.
Okay, so it's a really interesting moment because actually these two people sort of agree about the nonsense of the way that liberal feminism wants to change language, and they both agree that Ms. is a really bad idea. Buckley thinks that, you know, it's just not euphonious, you know, it's so jarring. Not euphonious, oh my God. And she says, well, it doesn't change the structural relationships of marriage. If you call yourself Mrs., you still are in a patriarchal construct and so on and so forth. So he thought she was kind of lunatic as far as trying to take down the family and so on and so forth. But they agreed about this one issue in language. And after she was on the show, he wrote her a thank you note, as he always did, to his guests. And he said, God damn it, you're good. He really enjoyed it. And unfortunately, she did not want to come back on the show. But it was a really terrific show. They had just debated at the Cambridge Student Union just a week before, and she had resoundingly won that debate about women's liberation by a vote of the Cambridge students. So in a way, this episode was kind of a rematch after that debate. Now, Buckley also had, of course, anti-feminists on the show. The subject of the Equal Rights Amendment came up a lot over the years, and this is Phyllis Schlafly, the anti-feminist activist. And he also had Margaret Thatcher on the show twice. And this, I want to show you a clip from the Q&A. Of course, she was not there to talk about women's liberation. She really did not want to talk about gender issues at all. But Jeff Greenfield, who was one of the common Q&A guys at the time on the questioner panel as a young man, brought it up. And so this is their exchange.
I'm wondering if in your own case, your reputation when you were a cabinet member with under Mr. Heath's administration, the sobriquet was Margaret Thatcher Milk Snatcher because of your objection to the free milk program. Whether that and your ideological stand helped you within the Conservative Party overcome some of the stereotypical objections that might have been raised to a woman holding office?
No. Would you be so very surprised if I said that at home, on the whole, we just look at the person and not necessarily the sex? You would. That's because you're a man. I mean, you're limited.
That's opposed to...
No, certainly. You read the public expenditure thing and milk snatcher. The interesting thing to me is that the Labour government has not restored the free milk, in spite of all the propaganda. But, look, I honestly I regard these questions as very trivial. You don't mind my saying so.
And if I did, what would I do?
Poor Jeff Greenfield, he takes it, but you can sense the sweat breaking out in his upper lip. He's just been told off by Margaret Thatcher. And Buckley is great because, you know, Thatcher is saying, well, gender's just not an issue in the UK. It's just not relevant. And Buckley's just poppycock. That's nonsense. You know, if women are so qualified, how come there aren't more women in office? What's going on? And he really pushes back in a very interesting way. Another great episode was, he did a few episodes with Claire Booth Luce, but this one episode I want to show you two clips from, she specifically asked to be on the show to talk about feminism. And they were old friends, and he couldn't disagree with the idea of having her on the show. So he did, and he gave her this long, very positive introduction. And he concluded the introduction by saying, I should like to begin by asking if you find the way that people introduce you on television talk shows to be condescending. And here's what she says.
Bill, I thank you for that warm and extraordinarily friendly introduction. You'll be pleased to know that in the entire introduction, which was flattering to say the least, there was only one masculine put-down. This is a high level of achievement for a man introducing a woman. You spoke of her inability on occasions to hold her tongue. Now, had you been speaking of a man who spoke out and made enemies for himself in the process, whether he was speaking out stupidly or rightly, wrongly, you would have said, he is blunt. He makes enemies by what he says. He is overly candid. You might have used many phrases, but the phrase, hold her tongue, is a phrase that men frequently use about children and women.
Sort of comes out taming the shrew?
No, it comes out of man's desire, highly successful, through the centuries to master women.
Okay, so that's the beginning of the show. And then at the end of the show, as he's about to cut to the Q&A session, he says to her, the notion that women are inferior to men is an original sin of which I am not guilty. That women are inferior to men has never occurred to me. That they are different is patently obvious. Yet, I would not want to see them behind the wheel of every Mack truck. But I think you would find that insulting, or would you? He's saying, what do you really think? And this is her response.
Bill, I'm much too fond of you to tell you what I really think about you.
Publicly.
Publicly.
This flash.
I think you're one of the most charming and subtle and sophisticated of male chauvinists.
Okay, so I love that. Oh, excuse me. I love that. It's so kind of flirty, and bashful and everything. But she says, I never say it to you publicly. And obviously, over a 3-martini lunch at Paoni's, his favorite Italian restaurant, you can imagine her telling him off quite a bit privately. So it's a wonderful sort of public moment of friendly disagreement between these two. So now that I've shown you a bit of the show, what I want to do is read to you from the book. And I'm going to read to you some excerpts from the introduction and then from the chapter on the civil rights and black power movement. So give you a sense of the flavor of the book. And that's about 20 minutes. And then we will open up to Q&A. So, although the program was undeniably his for 33 years, Firing Line was not Buckley's idea to begin with. This is not altogether surprising. It is hard to imagine a TV star less interested in TV than Buckley. He won an Emmy for Firing Line in 1969, and it was the longest-running public affairs show with a single host in U.S. history, but Buckley remained a TV industry outsider. It would be somewhat unfair, even uncouth, to describe Buckley as a snob. He did write a fun novel about Elvis Presley, after all. And if he failed to understand how anyone could consider Mick Jagger a good singer, his voice couldn't be better than that of, say, every 4th person listed in the telephone directory. He did at least listen to the Beatles during his weekly sessions with his personal trainer. This was perhaps a masochistic choice, as he really could not stand the Beatles. In 1970, he consented to be interviewed by Playboy magazine. This made him practically hip. That same year, he appeared on the NBC comedy show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, explaining that, I did an interview with Playboy because I decided it was the only way to communicate my views to my son. And noting that he had only agreed to appear on Laugh-In because the producers offered to fly him out to California on an airplane with 2 right wings. Laugh-In staged a sort of press conference for Buckley where cast member Henry Gibson queried, "Mr. Buckley, I've noticed that whenever you appear on television, you're always seated. Does this mean you can't think on your feet?" Buckley cannily responded, "It's very hard to stand up carrying the weight of what I know." Asked his opinion about nudity in entertainment, he tersely replied, "It's excessive." And asked finally whose image would be more harmed by his appearance on Laugh-In, his or the show's, he laughed and said, "Well, I suppose it will make you more respectable," coy wink inserted here, "and me less so, and both of those are probably to be desired." He had managed to play along and be a good sport while remaining the dignified face of conservatism. It's doubtful he'd ever watched an entire episode of Laugh-In, but he did admit to a real fondness for All in the Family. Archie Bunker, he noted on a 1979 Firing Line episode with Ben Stein, is the greatest anti-conservative ripoff in the history of modern offensives. I mean, you don't need Karl Marx, all you need is Archie Bunker. He's despicable, but he's kind of endearing in a way. Buckley was once late for a dinner party hosted by Nelson Rockefeller because he was at home watching All in the Family. Conveying a startling openness to television viewing, Buckley once acknowledged that anybody who wants effectively to understand what's going on has got to watch TV. The most bookish man I ever knew, Whittaker Chambers, watched television uninterruptedly from about 7 until 11 every single night of his life. Yet Buckley also noted that he was too busy to watch TV very much himself. He honestly had no idea who Jabba the Hutt was. He admitted to never watching professional football, and during his run for mayor of New York City, he was stumped by a reference to Mickey Mantle. All of which is to say, Buckley was neither unaware of the importance of mass culture nor deeply plugged into it himself. He was a devoted yachtsman and harpsichordist who got his kicks listening to Bach. In a TV world of expository theme songs issuing from the Sherwood Schwartz School of Music, here's the story of a lovely lady who was bringing up 3 very lovely girls. How audacious it was for Buckley to choose an excerpt from the Brandenburg Concertos as his own program's theme song. Although he occasionally settled down to watch an old movie on TV, what Buckley loved was the power to click from show to show. In fact, his family saw fit to slip not only a jar of peanut butter into his casket, but also a remote control. Individual programs were of fleeting interest to the founder and editor of America's most important conservative journal of opinion, a man who took vacations with the Reagans at Claudette Colbert's beach house in Barbados, thought that a peanut butter and bacon sandwich could only be improved by a lovely bottle of 1949 Lafitte Rothschild, and traveled annually to Gstaad, Switzerland to write a book, taking daily ski breaks with David Niven and John Kenneth Galbraith. Given his high culture bona fides, it would have been odd if Buckley had actually originated the idea of hosting a TV show, even a political one. In his 1989 book on Firing Line, Buckley says that the idea for the show was pitched to him in 1965 by a young entrepreneur. Buckley was agreeable to the notion, but deferred production until 1966 so that he could complete his symbolic run for mayor of New York. It was only in his posthumous book on Ronald Reagan that Buckley publicly revealed that Firing Line was the brainchild of conservative businessman Tom O'Neill. O'Neill's company, RKO, produced and syndicated the show from 1966 until 1971, when Firing Line left the commercial syndication market behind for the comparative stability of PBS. Firing Line was initially imagined as a 13-episode series, but ultimately ran for almost 1,500 episodes. To understand how impressive these numbers are for a weekly show, consider that today a very successful program typically runs 7 seasons for a total of 154 episodes. There were 635 episodes of the long-running Gunsmoke and 456 episodes of Law & Order. Buckley claimed from the beginning, perhaps with some pride, that his ratings were exiguous, which means scanty or meager, if anyone actually doesn't know that. In fact, Buckley would never turn a profit on Firing Line or National Review for that matter. These were labors of love and also, of course, ideological dedication. Buckley, the supreme free market capitalist, observed that there are enterprises in life that simply aren't devised to generate profits. We accept them as institutions that need to be patronized because they do vital work. As an ardent advocate for Firing Line was not the only unprofitable public affairs type talk show on TV. There was also David Susskind's Open End, for example, as well as the Mike Wallace interview and the long-running Meet the Press. But Firing Line was the only specifically conservative example of such programming. If Firing Line was unique as a specifically conservative public affairs program, it did mirror the dull aesthetic of other public affairs shows. As Buckley described it, "My television program Firing Line was modestly designed. No production values," exclaimed one horrified TV executive. It was, to say the least, not a good-looking show. The carpeted dais was drab, the lighting never varied, and many of the guests were men in suits, their legs crossed, trousers riding up above black socks revealing an inch or two of pale white skin. The exceptions: Black Power spokesmen wearing dramatic dashikis, feminists sporting smart plaid pantsuits, anti-feminists flaunting Ann Landers-style hairdos, brought only occasional visual relief. One could also count on the distraction of Buckley's distinctive mannerisms, his almost British accent, his inclination to dart his tongue out like a lizard. Jeff Greenfield, who emceed a 20-year anniversary celebration program, noted that television is said to be a visual medium. The only element of visual interest on Firing Line I have ever been able to detect is whether Mr. Buckley would someday part his hair with his tongue. But it really didn't matter. Viewers came for the words and the ideas, and also perhaps when the show premiered in 1966 for the sheer novelty of seeing an articulate right-wing conservative explain his position. Whether you watched the show as a liberal or conservative viewer, you would find your politics both defended and challenged. In 1964, Richard Hofstadter had famously attributed right-wing political thinking to paranoia, anti-intellectualism, and status anxiety. Whether you thought his politics were brilliant or abhorrent, Buckley seemed to be walking, talking proof of the insufficiency of Hofstadter's claims. As if to drive the point home, one of Firing Line's earliest guests was Barry Goldwater. To many Americans, Goldwater's landslide defeat confirmed David Susskind's confident claims about the triumph of liberalism and the waning of the extremism that Hofstadter had described. Buckley was determined to show the world that conservatism was alive and well, if struggling for the foothold it needed in order to dominate American politics, and that paranoid conspiracy theorists of the John Birch Society variety should not be taken as synecdochic for the conservative movement. To truly understand Firing Line, then, we must consider how Buckley used the show to stake a claim for Goldwater, and by extension, to stake a claim for what then seemed a pipe dream, the possibility of a thriving conservative movement, purged of the conspiracy theorists, the extremists, and the kooks. These were the folks who seemed to have a stranglehold on American conservatism when Firing Line began in 1966. Buckley would have to forge a new image for conservatism virtually from scratch. So that is how the introduction concludes, and I'm going to skip ahead so you can see a bit more of a deep dive into the show to the chapter on civil rights and Black Power. In its first 10 years on the air, Firing Line focused often on the civil rights and Black Power movements. As a right-wing conservative, Buckley was, of course, concerned about the kinds of systemic upheaval called for by both approaches to the problem of American racism. But it would be much too simple to reduce his approach to one of unalloyed resistance. He did not oppose, for example, the elimination of racial discrimination, the encouragement of Black personal and economic empowerment, the existence of integrated schools, or the preferential treatment of Blacks in hiring decisions. But he did oppose most federal government intervention in these issues. It was one thing to express his convictions about these issues in his columns and books, and quite another to deal with them in dialogue with advocates of civil rights and Black Power, or on the other side, with advocates for the maintenance of the racist and segregated status quo. This is what makes Firing Line so unique. On paper, for example, Buckley might have seemed comfortably aligned with the segregationist South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond on almost every issue. Whereas in person, disjunctures quickly became apparent. It was in conversation about racial issues with conservatives and liberals that many of the subtleties of Buckley's position were revealed. Black Power and civil rights leaders took advantage of Buckley's program as a venue in which to air their positions. Indeed, one does get a subtle sense that the Black radicals most opposed to Buckley felt they were using his program to air ideas in full, away from the soundbite culture that pervaded the rest of the media. Elsewhere, their comments would be edited. On Firing Line, they had to put up with a right-wing white guy asking hostile questions. But they could, on national television, express full-blown anti-establishment, revolutionary, and even Marxist arguments that usually only saw the light of day in underground newspapers and newsletters cranked out by hand on mimeograph machines. Given this context, the radicals generally avoided invective. There was more than self-restraint in play here. Producer Warren Steibel, a large, blustering man with a perpetually untucked shirt, gave red flag guests a stern lecture before they appeared on the show. Blue language was strictly off limits. He had so irked Allen Ginsberg by forbidding dirty words that Ginsberg complained that he would have to censor his thought patterns. There was extra concern about Eldridge Cleaver, and Buckley made a point of following up Stibel's lecture by suggesting to Cleaver before they started shooting that the FCC fee for cursing would cancel out his payment for appearing on the show. If there was any guest who did not need coaching in how not to incur the wrath of the FCC, it was civil rights maverick James Farmer, who was the very picture of decorum. In Where Does the Civil Rights Movement Go Now?, an episode from 1966, Buckley made some of his boilerplate libertarian arguments about parents having the right to send their children to any school they wanted. He complained that people kept discovering new rights, and he argued that James Baldwin was all wet. Baldwin was, Buckley judged, too pessimistic about what could be accomplished in America. Court co-founder Farmer cut a striking figure, radiating dignity and composure as he defended Baldwin. But he also conveyed a mounting frustration and anger that he seemed to try to tamp down with each new cigarette he lit. In his entrancing baritone, shades of James Earl Jones, Farmer counters that Baldwin's concerns about northern Negro ghettos are very important. Farmer: the fact of the matter is, most of our victories legislatively have spoken to the South and not to the North. And the 17-year-old dropout youth in a Harlem street couldn't care less if his second cousin in Mississippi can buy a hot dog. He says, man, what about the rats that bite me? What about the cockroaches? Buckley: why don't they kill those rats? Is there a law that says you can't kill the rats? I'm so tired of that argument. I've got rats, and I put traps all over the place. They're still there. I've never been able to get rid of them. Farmer: you know, in Harlem, if you kill one rat, 2 more come back to carry his carcass away. Buckley: well, why doesn't that happen in other cities? Is there special refuse there in Harlem? Why don't they do away with the refuse? It's a municipal function to get rid of the refuse, isn't it? Farmer: when you have an entire family, that's the state's duty to remove the garbage, isn't it? Buckley: look, I'm not suggesting demunicipalizing the garbage collection. Farmer: oh, you're in favor of garbage collection then? Buckley: I'm in favor of socialized garbage. Everyone laughs, including Farmer, and the tension is briefly eased, but Buckley won't let go of his insistence that there's nothing special about the ghetto garbage problem. When Farmer asks if rats have bitten his children, Buckley suggests that he's being melodramatic. There are more rhetorically refined moments in this program, as when Buckley and Farmer discuss the nature of the goals of the civil rights movement. But their discussion of the tenacious rat problem in the ghetto is the most memorable part of the show, because Buckley is so earnest, and yet so very incapable of comprehending the daily crises faced by those living in urban squalor. That the rat problem was worse in Harlem than Stamford, Connecticut, was simply implausible to him. By the time Huey P. Newton was on the show in 1973, the Black Panthers were struggling. Newton and Cleaver had had a falling out. Cleaver was still in exile in Algeria. Several leaders, such as Fred Hampton, had been killed. And the FBI had infiltrated the organization and planted seeds of dissension. A year later, Newton himself would flee to Cuba to escape a murder charge. On firing line, Newton was all smiles as he explained the Marxist dialectic. And Buckley was rhetorically flummoxed by his guest. At one point, the host exclaims, I'm attempting to pin down a point and I'm losing track of it. It may be that one of the difficulties you have as chief spokesman for the Black Panther Party is your total incoherence. That is to say, people don't understand what you're talking about. I don't understand what you're talking about, and I'm a very close listener. Newton talked in a cheerful, steady stream of Maoist propaganda, barely coming up for air. Finally, Buckley performed the firing line version of throwing in the towel. He put down his clipboard, signaling that he realized the futility of attempting to tame his guest logorrhea. For viewers already in sympathy with Newton's cause, his oration would likely not have seemed as incoherent as Buckley found it. Newton would have come across as a remarkably affable revolutionary. But those already inclined to be skeptical of the student radicals clutching Mao's little red book to their breasts would certainly have found their doubts confirmed by Newton's performance. A liberal firing line viewer in Cambridge, Massachusetts, wrote Buckley, I thought Huey Newton made a dialectic ass out of himself without any help from you. Whether or not Newton had made an ass of himself, there's no denying that he laid on the revolutionary shtick with a heavy hand. The Black Power movement was spiraling, and this was one of the final firing line episodes to address the topic. Later episodes of the 1970s that addressed race mostly centered on issues such as electoral politics and the legacy of the civil rights movement. Remarkably, many years later, Buckley would acknowledge his change of thinking regarding federalism and voting rights. In 2004, he told Time, I once believed that we could evolve our way up from Jim Crow. I was wrong. Federal intervention was necessary. The anti-racism, pro-states' rights advocate had come around, but by then almost everyone had, at least in theory. In his twilight years, Jesse Helms would still maintain that the South should have been left alone with its race problem. Buckley may have shifted his thoughts on federal intervention, but he certainly had not gone liberal in general where race was concerned. In fact, his interest in discussing racism, the civil rights movement, black power, and the implications of various strategies for improving the lot of American blacks had reached its apogee in the 60s and 70s. The topic of race was significantly less central on firing line in the 1980s. In 1998, Buckley had an interesting encounter with ACLU Executive Director Ira Glasser. Buckley twisted Glasser's arm for years to appear on a 2-hour firing line debate titled, "Resolved, that the ACLU is full of baloney." Glasser rightly saw it was a bit of a setup, but he finally consented to appear. Glasser dug into the National Review archive to find questionable stuff Buckley had said about civil rights, and he read it aloud on the show. Glasser describes this old National Review material as completely unrespectable, and he says that Buckley knew it. Shortly thereafter, Glasser was at dinner at the Buckley residence, and Bill's wife, Pat, asked him, "Why are you so hard on my husband, Bill, on television?" Glasser said, "Well, Pat, he says so many terrible things. You have to do something about that in private." Needless to say, she did not. This was just friendly dinner party banter. Off the air, the director of the ACLU and the architect of the post-war conservative movement got along smashingly. Glasser had taken Buckley to his first baseball game. He insisted they take the subway instead of Buckley's limo. And to Nathan's on Coney Island for hot dogs. This time Buckley won, they took the limo. Buckley liked Glasser, not despite the fact that on several occasions he had backed him into a corner on firing line, but precisely because of it. The price of advocating no-holds-barred TV debates was that sometimes you would lose, and your opponent would prove decisively that you had, at one point, really been full of baloney. I'm so glad. Thank you for coming.
Every single word. Oh, every single word. I've loved every moment of this. This has been great. I cannot wait to finish the book, which will be this weekend. Okay, Gore Vidal. Okay, and you've seen the recent documentary about that.
Best of Enemies.
Yeah, Best of Enemies. Exactly. What did you think of it? And particularly. The Gore Vidal, in the documentary, it says that Gore Vidal knew that Buckley wouldn't prepare for the whatever debate, such as it was. Is that true? And what was his preparation for the shows? And I was raised on this show, and what was his preparation on the show? That would be one question. The other question is, I've been told, but don't know, that English is not Buckley's first language. It's actually Spanish. And is that true? And what's the source of that kind of cut glass, patrician kind
cut
of?
Glass
you know what
patrician is a lovely
exactly,
way to put it.
Exactly.
Well, I'll answer both of your
Okay.
questions. First of all, Best of Enemies, I want to plug that movie. It's a terrific documentary. I think the last 5 minutes, it says a few things I think are a little too overreaching about this being the beginning of Fox News, the beginning of the end in sort of civil debate. And I don't think that's quite spot on, but it's a really good film. And they do note in the film that Buckley did not prepare for his first encounter with Gore Vidal. They were having a discussion at the Democratic National Conventions in 1968, and they paid them both handsomely to be on the show. ABC did, but before they were on, they asked Buckley, "Would you do this commentary?" And he said, "Well, yeah, okay." And they said, "Well, is there anyone you wouldn't want to appear with?" And he said, "Oh, I appear with anyone except Gore Vidal." And then, of course, they set him up with Gore Vidal. It was a kind of gotcha thing. And they had several encounters on television. And the first one, it's true that Buckley did underprepare, and Vidal was overprepared, and he had practiced all of his off-the-cuff quips. I mean, he had scripted the hell out of this thing. So he was really very prepared. And by the time they had their second discussion, Buckley was much more prepared. And then at the end, he lost his temper, and he was forever kind of mortified by that, that he'd been uncivil and used cuss words on television and so on. So he did prepare for the second part. Now, the question about the show preparation, he had a researcher at National Review office, and it was Agatha Schmidt, for some years, and and a few other people came in and out. And I've seen the folders of research material. They would photocopy newspaper, magazine articles, give background and so on, so that he had all the materials in front of them. And he was a very busy man. So he would be studying this material in his limo on the way to the show. He'd, read the books that had been written by the people on the show already. He was a voracious reader. This was a man who read a book at the barber shop. He couldn't take a break. He was so busy that he would just read a book while they cut his hair, right? So he would prepare, on the fly, and then he'd do the show and get back in his limo and type the next editorial column he had to write on a special typing table in his limo in the back, right? So he was very well prepared for the shows. And you would see one of the charming things about the show is the way people have their notepads around them, their yellow legal pads, and maybe glasses and a Kleenex and a glass of water, and in the early days lots of cigarettes on the show. And there's a kind of clutter, it's sort of no production values, like it's just poorly designed, And so you'll see him during an interview looking down. You see this with the mailer clip I showed you, like what's next, kind of figuring it out. So in an answer to your second question, it is true that Buckley's first language had been Spanish. His nanny was Spanish speaking, and so he learned Spanish first, and then he learned English, and then he learned French. Apparently his French, he thought he was very good in his French, but apparently it was a little awkward and weird. Maybe it had a Spanish accent, I don't know. But he was homeschooled in the early years of his life, and they actually had a townhouse with all the kids. I can't remember, 8 or 10 kids, and they would rotate from floor to floor, like, okay, Spanish on the first floor, and then, political science on the second floor, and then go down for math, and they would, rotate through the house all day. And at a certain point, he was sent to a British boarding school. His mother was enduring a difficult pregnancy, and they sent him away. They thought that was better. And so he picked up this British accent that never totally went away. And then there was a little bit of Connecticut thrown in there. So you had, I don't think you sense a Spanish inflection in there at all, but it's kind of amazing sort of hodgepodge of language backgrounds that he had. And his brother, James Buckley, had a similar voice. It wasn't quite as distinctive and weird, but there's that subtle, almost British inflection underneath it. Yeah, people thought it was put on. He was just like, this is how I talk. In fact, he was interviewed on 60 Minutes right before Reagan was sworn in. And they were like, why do you talk like that? Why do you use such big words? And he said, that's just how I talk. I mean, I talk to my dog that way. I use big, that's the best way. And you just need to find the right word to express what you have to say. Sometimes very precise words are the way to go.
Right, thanks. Your book is excellent. I really, really enjoyed it. One of the things you say in the conclusion is that you think, and you've said this as you've talked about, I've listened to a few of your interviews on radio as you've promoted the book, that there really is a void in the contemporary media landscape, and that there could be a place for a reprisal of firing line. That we really don't have this on cable news, that there's a thirst for a real honest intellectual combat. And I think my question for you is, given that Buckley really helped sort of mainstream and make the conservative movement palatable to the left by not just taking on liberals, but really taking on liberal radicals, as you point out, that he helped people see that conservatives weren't radicals themselves, I think, in contrast. And that answered a real need in the conservative movement of the 1960s or 70s. But in the sort of American conservative movement in 2016, it faces different challenges than the conservative movement then. And so I wonder, if there were to be a reprisal firing line, what service could it play? And I appreciate that I'm not asking you as a conservative this, but what could it do for a modern conservative movement in terms of credibility, or because I think in fact, given that we're in a Trump era and a new era, there's really a lot it could do.
Yeah, I agree, and it's important to note things are different now than they were in the 60s, obviously, but we do have a resurgence of extremism, right-wing rhetoric and talk, the birthers and so on. I mean, there's just been a lot of, I sometimes talk about the extremists as kind of like weeds in a garden, and Buckley, pull them out, and then they come back again. It's a constant sort of battle within the conservative movement to deal with the fringe right, and of course on the liberal side there are fringe left-wing people, and there's management on both sides, I guess I would say. I would hope that there would be a space for this kind of civil discussion on television today, and we're in a niche era. right? Where there seems to be television for everyone. If you want a show about how to buy a house and flip it and turn, you can find that. If you want a show about gardening, if you're interested in pets, I mean, it's such a subdivided marketplace of interests. And the thought that there's not one niche in there for sophisticated political discussion that's long form, that's not cut up with clips, I mean, that's unthinkable. There has to be room for that. And what I say in the book, in the conclusion that you reference, is that possibly this could be on HBO, which has a reputation for quality. It's where the show was shot for many years, and it's a place where a show wouldn't have to be interrupted by advertisements, and people would just sit down and talk. So it may be sort of pie in the sky, but I think it's useful to imagine what this kind of discussion could mean. What ultimately it could mean for the conservative movement is harder to speculate about. I think it's too soon to tell, what's going to happen next for the conservative movement and for the Republican Party. They are at this kind of crossroads now. Will a third party emerge at this moment? Is there a sense that the Republican Party has been corrupted, or is that not the answer? I mean, I don't have a crystal ball to predict that. But if there were a venue where people who disagree very strongly politically could talk through their ideas without shouting at each other, without saying, cut off his mic, and this kind of nonsense that we see on Fox News and also on MSNBC, there's all the overproduced spectacle of shouting, that could only be salutary for the movement. It would have to be helpful, but I can't say, in a direct cause and effect way, it would fix the conservative movement. It wouldn't. TV's not that powerful. TV's helpful, though.
The beginning of this show came on the heels of the end of Vatican II, so I'm wondering if he had on any leading figures of American Catholicism.
He stuck to liberal religious figures because he wanted to debunk some of their ideas. He was very concerned about the political involvement of the church. And of course, he was not thrilled about Vatican II. This is someone who found a priest willing to say the Mass for him in Latin for 30 or 40 years. He would just have his own private service in Latin, right? Yeah. So he had on Reverend Coffin, Reverend Sloan, I'm dropping the name, yes, from Yale, and to talk about, what is the role of political activism? Shouldn't you be tending to people's souls until it said these larger political activities, And that was a really interesting discussion. But there were, over the years, not a huge number of Catholics who were in agreement with him, except for Malcolm Muggeridge, who would convert to Catholicism fairly late in his life. But they would have theological discussions about the nature of faith and so on and so forth. And one thing that's interesting was his relationship to the Christian right, that he voiced a kind of respect for what they were doing politically. But I think, and it's hypothesis, but I think it's correct, that he didn't get that kind of faith practice. He didn't get this kind of loud, sort of seemed crude to him compared to Catholicism, the way that evangelicals were practicing, and the kind of direct translation of politics, of religion into politics in one-to-one way, and so on and so forth. So he thought some of the things they were pushing for were right on, but he really had very, very few of those people on the show. And at a moment when they were really impacting the conservative movement. And in the 80s and into the 90s, I mean, he didn't really care for Pat Robertson. He did in theory, he, knew him outside of the media sphere, but he wasn't, having these people on the show. And one of the interesting shows is with Jerry Falwell, where Falwell comes on and speaks very moderately about how he just wants a liberal, pluralistic society in which everyone can express their opinions, including fundamentalist Christians. And Buckley says, well, sir, I've read all your literature, and you seem very moderate here. You're very different from how you convey yourself to your constituents. Just acknowledging you're spinning yourself for a mass audience, but really we know that you're a radical guy. And Falwell just wouldn't acknowledge it. So one thing that's interesting is how he wants all these big political players on, and yet when it comes to the Christian right, he's just like, yeah, their ideas are good, but he doesn't really welcome them to the show. But I would say if you want to look at his engagement with ideas of faith and Catholicism, the best way is to look at the Malcolm Muggeridge episodes. In fact, he often, one of his favorite episodes was an episode with Malcolm Muggeridge that they shortened to a half hour and they ran every Christmas for years. And his other favorite was the Panama Canal debate 2-hour debate with Ronald Reagan, which he was on the other side of the fence from Ronald Reagan, and from most conservatives. And the other favorite episode was Solzhenitsyn, which was actually a BBC interview with Solzhenitsyn, and then they replayed it on the show, and they had a conversation afterwards.
I've been very much looking forward to reading the book. I'm a huge fan. In Russia, probably, there's not enough fans to make a proper firing line fan society, so had to come all the way here to join one. My question is related to the the making of the leader of conservative movement intellectually. How do you think? What was so special about Buckley that really helped him garner the clout of a sort of overreaching, supernatural, transcendent figure that would come, as you say, like sort the weeds out? That would, if needed, cast aside the Birch Society and would always be there in terms of overlooking the movement, you know, because as far as I see now, there's not a single person on the right with whom everybody on the right would agree within 5 or 7 minutes, and I think that was different. 30, 40 years ago.
I wouldn't want to overstate that everyone agreed with
How
Buckley
did he achieve that?
on the conservative side, but he was very popular. There were always some people on the far right who was like, oh, this guy's an elitist, he went to Yale, and you know, that more populist side was opposed to him. But you're right, he achieved this kind of almost consensus among the movement, and it's hard to say that how that happened, what the sort of magic formula was. And of course, he was so unique. It's not like we'll have another Buckley who is that erudite and smart and funny. And that was so much, I think a lot of what was appealing about him was he had such a fine-tuned sense of humor that, you know, conversation would turn very serious. And it's not like he would suddenly crack a joke, but he had a sensibility that politics has a humorous side to it, that we have to keep our sense of humor, and that's part of what, you know, keeps us human and talking to the other side and so on. And that's something that seems quite lacking today. I mean, notably, one of the very worst episodes of Firing Line is when he has Groucho Marx on. He's very funny, except when he talks about humor, and then it's just disastrous. He doesn't get any of Groucho's jokes. It's worth watching. It's a terrible show, but it's like it's appealing in its awfulness. It's like the worst Godzilla movie you've ever seen. You're like, I can't believe I'm seeing this. But yeah, I'm not sure quite how he did it, but I do think that the humor was a key part of that. And I think also just being in a mass media era, like I was just saying before about this kind of neat stratification of the culture, it's hard to imagine one figure emerging as the, you know, this key voice on television everyone looks at, because we don't have 3 channels plus PBS. We have, you know, hundreds of channels. So it's harder to make a splash in the media in certain ways, unless you are extreme and loud and paranoid, or, you know, crude or whatever, those kinds of things that are ratings grabbers.
Play that part in that with Buckley. How will he manage that and develop a conversation with a person who had so opposite? With
someone like the president-elect, you mean? Yeah, I towards the end, I am talking about, thank you for referencing that specific moment, where Buckley responded to current events, but he always liked to look at the bigger picture. And so unlike the news media cycle where you have to respond to what happened that day, on the show he could bring in someone to talk about what's the future of the Conservative Party, which is exactly what he would be talking about right now. Where do we go from here? Where do Republicans go? Where do Conservatives go? And he would want to be looking at the big picture and trying to conceptualize it. It's what we need. So I hypothesize in the book that, you know, if he were around at this moment, he would have an episode like, what's up with outsider political candidates? He had titles like that, in which they would discuss, you know, how did this person come from out of the blue, wasn't a politician, was elected president, you know, and they would have a kind of conceptual discussion about what was going on and try to sort it out. Now, as for President-elect Trump specifically, people ask me all the time, what would he have really thought about this guy? And we don't have to speculate. He wrote an article in Cigar Aficionado magazine in 2009 or 10, not where we usually turn for our politics necessarily, but he wrote an article there about Trump and Jesse the Body Ventura, who was the wrestler who became governor, I believe, of Minnesota. And the article was called something like Attack of the Demagogues, or The Demagogues Are Coming. And he handily really takes down Trump and describes him as a demagogue and a narcissist. He was really offended by him. He was offended by the notion that, and he, Buckley was so proper, offended his notions of propriety that this person would run for office without qualifications. I think he would have been very proud of the stance that National Review took throughout the election. I mean, they were one of the first big players to come out against Trump with a cover of National Review with Yosemite Sam caricature of Trump with the guns firing, and really just saying, like, no way. At the same time, the magazine had place for conservatives who supported Trump. Like their official line was that they did not support him. But the magazine was always a space where different conservative points of view could sort of hash it out. And there was never a strictly ban on one ideological perspective. And so I think he would have been very pleased with how the magazine negotiated in the days leading up to the election. And what I'm seeing now is more kind of a pragmatism in what I'm reading of National Review, where they're just like, okay, this is what happened. Now where do we go from here? What's he going to do? And they're not, they're speculating about polling and so on, but they're really being very issue focused and wondering what's going to happen with Iran and what's going to, kind of sorting it out. So, yeah.
The two quick follow-up questions. One with respect to ratings, which you referenced, and you referenced in the book,
Exiguous.
and then the other with respect to funding, which we also know a little bit about the early stages of funding. But as a very long-running show on PBS, how involved was Buckley in sort of the continued funding of the show when it was on PBS? And then how did the ratings matter or not matter once he was on PBS as well?
That's a great question. The ratings were up and down when he says they were always poor. They were up and down a bit when he was syndicated. He was being sold on a market-to-market basis, and he was produced by RKO initially before he goes to PBS in 1970. And the ratings were up and down in part because it was a clunky system. They were scheduling him poorly. People who loved the show were watching it every day at 8 o'clock or once a week at 8 o'clock, and then suddenly we moved to Sunday morning. What? And actually, they moved it to Sunday morning right after it won its first Emmy, or its only Emmy. And Buckley wrote them a letter saying, what are you doing? We just won an Emmy. You moved it to Sunday morning where every respectable person is in church or golfing. And, what are you thinking? So he had to flee the syndication market to PBS, and where the ratings were less relevant. You weren't going to rise and fall in ratings. They weren't selling advertising time on PBS. And one thing that's really interesting about the show is you have this person who's, this huge voice of the free market, and he has to leave the free market for his TV show to succeed. And as he freely acknowledged, some things you don't do for profit, you do because they're good. He said at one point, someone said, why would you do this when it doesn't make money? And he said, well, do you expect the Catholic Church to make money? And I mean, in fact, the Catholic Church is doing just fine. But his point was that, you could be in a not-for-profit endeavor, and it was worthy. Once he was on PBS, he did about as well as the other public affairs shows on PBS. So PBS never published, showed their ratings, but they sporadically would hire Nielsen to do numbers for them, and then send the numbers out to their producers running the programs. And he was doing, okay. I mean, which means like on the low end. I mean, the highest numbers for PBS were Sesame Street. They were really, they had Upstairs, Downstairs, and Masterpiece Theater, and these kind of British imports that were popular into the 70s and 80s. And to Buckley's chagrin, Monty Python's Flying Circus did very well on PBS, and much better than Firing Line. And PBS was thrilled because they had no young viewers except the toddler set from Sesame Street, and so they're getting young male viewers specifically watching Monty Python, and Buckley's just, what is Monty Python? I mean, it was just beneath him to even consider that this was, you know, a good TV show. And I actually say in the book that he must have been so chagrined when Margaret Thatcher parodied the dead parrot sketch from Monty Python, you know, once in a public address, you know, although he might just not have even gotten it. You know, she said something like, the Liberal Party is dead. This is a dead Liberal Party. You know, something like he's making fun of the dead parrot sketch. And he was probably just like, what is she doing? You know? So he got along on PBS. And then when the Reagan administration defunded PBS, and Nixon tried to defund it, and, you know, all of PBS programming has some ups and downs from that. But when Reagan defunded PBS, what's great is to read the letters that Buckley sent out to people raising money, where he said, like, joy, Reagan has defunded PBS, now I need you to pay for it. And not surprisingly, he was supporting the free market and capitalism, and there were a lot of wealthy capitalists who were like, yes, here's some money to keep your show going. It's the greatest show. And so he, in particular the Olin Foundation, but other private foundations and so on and so forth, funded the show over the years. And so he had some ups and downs on PBS, but basically there was never a doubt that, you know, he would get the money he needed once it was defunded in the 80s. So it soldiered on.
In your preparation for and research on the book, you must have read some of his books. Yes. I'm sure a lot of them. Did you have any favorites among those that you thought sort of really got to him? Not his Blackford Oaks, you know, which are great, but, you know, his other stuff, you know, that where you felt like he was really at the height of his powers.
If I believe, I think it's Cruising Speed. Yes. Is that set like Cruising 72 Speed. Or so? Yes. That's a really fun one. I would recommend Cruising Speed. Right. A lot of people like The Unmaking of the Mayor the most, and they say it ranks up there with the new journalism and so on and so forth. And I think it's okay, but Cruising Speed I think is a really fun and interesting read. And he's sort of at the peak of his power and his renown and so on. And he's dealing with political issues, but giving a sense of his lifestyle, but not so much that you're like, okay, you have a limo and you have a sailboat, and you know, this, you know, it's not so heavy-handed as some of the later books, and you know, he talks about personalities, like, you know, he went to a gay bar with Truman Capote, he and his wife, and you know, just sort of comfortable with that, and you're like, wait, what? So I think probably Cruising Speed would be one that I would recommend.